Another review of a comic book. This is Donald Duck, Lost in the Andes by Carl Barks. And this is a collection of Carl Barks comics published by Fantagraphics publisher. This is part of Fantagraphics' project to reprint the entirety of Carl Barks' work, or at least his work on the Donald Duck characters. Now, as I think is becoming common with publishers nowadays, the projected series is going to reprint everything, and the volumes are going to be numbered in order. But the volumes are not being released in order. So this is the first volume that got released, but this is volume number 7. So I'm not sure if the number... Oh, yeah, here it is. You can find it in fine print here. Volume number 7. The reason I know it's volume number 7 is because of Wikipedia. Otherwise, it's not very prominent. I don't believe it's not very prominent on this book anywhere. But yeah, this is volume number 7 of that collection. But this was the first collection that they released. And volumes 1 and 2, I believe, still haven't been released yet. So the reason for that is, I guess, in order to ensure that this series will get enough popular support and be profitable, the publishers decided to release these books not in order, but in the order that they thought would be the most popular with the public. So once these are all released and all out there in the public, then the numberings will make sense, I guess. Then you can read the complete collection from volume 1 all the way to volume 30, however many there ended up being. But this is volume 7, even though this is the volume that got released first. And if memory serves, this was originally printed in 2011. Yes, 2011 is when this originally came out. So does that make sense? This is a reprinting of Donald Duck comics that were originally printed in 1948 and 1949. This was released in 2011. This is volume 7 of a projected series which will cover all of Carl Barks' Donald Duck comics. But this was the first one that got released of that series. Now, I've already reviewed one other comic in this series so far. That was the Balloonatics one. And in my previous review of that comic, I talked all about the background, who Carl Barks was, what these Donald Duck comics were, my history with reading Donald Duck comics at a young age, the DuckTales cartoons, all of that. And because I've already blabbed on about that in a previous video, I'm going to do my best to resist the temptation to talk about all that background information again. I already did it once, and I'm going to try my best not to do it again. I'll link to the previous video in the description down below. But for this video, I'm going to try not to repeat myself. Try being the operative word. These videos are unscripted, so we'll see what detours my brain leads me down. But I'm going to try not to repeat myself. So, these volumes, based on the couple I've read, and I assume those couple are representative, follow a pattern. Sorry, these volumes, these collected volumes. So there's an introduction, which is some academic guy talking about the significance of Carl Barks' work. And then there are the comics, and then... The comics themselves are divided into 3 sections. There's the longer adventures. There's the mid-size adventures, which are 10 pages each. And then at the very end, there's the 1-page gags. All of these were released in 1948 and 1949, but they are ordered by length. As the publishers say at the very back of the book. How do they phrase this? We have taken the liberty of separating stories into chapters according to length, so that the longer adventure yarns lead off the book, followed by the short stories and gags. So the Carl Barks library comprising Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge stories were originally published, blah, 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 blah. The stories will be published in chronological order by volume, but not within each volume. So they're, yeah, that's the way that these are being organized. But all of these are from 1948 and 1949. And then when you get to the end, there's story notes where you've got some academic guy talking about the significance of each story. So these story notes are interesting. I'm glad they're in here. They gave me some background information on some of these stories and the cultural history behind them I was not aware of. They might be going a little bit over the top, like you get the impression that these story notes are sometimes praising the stories or overemphasizing the significance of Carl Barks. I mean, I don't know how many times the word genius gets repeated here in these story notes. And you think to yourself, am I reading about a Donald Duck artist, or am I reading about Shakespeare here, the way this is so fully praised? And Donald Alt, the guy who, one of the names who appears in here frequently, and who penned the big introduction which started off this volume, talks about how he teaches these comics in his university classes. Let me see. He mentions it a few times. Let me see if I can find a good quote. Sorry, maybe I should have bookmarked some of these ahead of time. But in this introduction, he mentions several times. Oh, yeah. Here we go. In all my years of teaching Barks's comics in university classrooms, students always call my attention to details of visual construction, body language, facial expressions, dialogues, or aspects of a situation that I had never noticed before, even though I had read and taught the story 100 times. Yeah, I mean, maybe if I had read these stories a few more times and studied them, I'd appreciate their genius more. But that just strikes me as a little bit over the top to be teaching these stories in a university classroom, not just once, but hundreds of times. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a fan. I wouldn't be reading these stories if I wasn't. But I would tend to classify this as interesting diversions for children and nostalgic adults, rather than something that gets taught in a university classroom. But I guess, the Carl Barks scholars, as they are, will break down his visual genius and his storytelling genius in these story notes. And I do have to admit that after reading the story notes, I appreciate it a little bit more. Let me see if I can find... For example, the story notes for this story here talk about how Carl Barks makes use of the frame panel. So here we have Donald Duck and his cousin Gladstone, each taking up half the panel. And then the perspective changes over here, where there are 3 different fields of action, and each one distinctively separated from each other. And I don't want to take credit for any of this. I'm just parroting what the guy said in the story notes, he drew my attention to how this was constructed. And then perspectives like this, where the shovel is in the foreground to make it appear much larger, and Donald Duck is in the background. And this visual has the effect of making us feel how heavy this shovel has become for Donald after all that time shoveling. So those are the kinds of things that I would never have picked up myself were it not for some of those academics in the story notes talking about the significance of the artwork here and the storytelling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. So this collection opens up with an introduction, which was interesting. It goes into a lot of things here, but it talks about Karl Barks's biography. And there was a lot of interesting stuff in here about his biography I did not know. So, for example, I never knew how many odd jobs Karl Barks had worked in his life. I never knew that he was part of the animation department in Disney Studios. I thought he had just been only in the comic books, but I guess he, as was pointed out in these notes and the notes at the end, part of the reason he was so successful in these Donald Duck comics is because of his experience having worked in the Donald Duck cartoons in Disney Studios. Never realized some of the tragedies of Karl Barks's life, which also goes into here. His 2 failed marriages, one to an alcoholic woman, a daughter who died in 1993, and the legal battles, which made up the end of his life, and which kind of, one gets the impression from this, consumed his elderly years with legal battles against unscrupulous company managers. So some interesting stuff in here. Now the collection starts off with this running away from a giant boulder, which is, I believe, the direct inspiration for the boulder scene from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. As it says right here in the introduction. So George Lucas and Steven Spielberg had read these Donald Duck cartoon comic books as kids, and Donald Duck going off to exotic locations and having adventures and the boulders and the booby traps and kind of ancient temples is part of the inspiration for the Indiana Jones adventures. My one complaint is this story is not actually in this collection. So I was reading this, I'm like, oh, cool. Is this actual story here in this collection? And it's not. But I guess because this was the first Fantagraphics volume that was published, they wanted to start off with the big guns and talking about the big influences of Karl Barks. But this introduction here is more of a general introduction to Karl Barks's life and work, and not any of the specific stories in this volume. The specific stories in this volume are all covered in the story notes at the end. But we do have a classic Donald Duck travels to exotic locations here, and Donald Duck Lost in the Andes, which is the title story of this volume. And this story is classic Donald Duck. So it's adventure in those exotic locations, but it's never a very serious adventure. It's always kind of got one eye on being silly. More than one eye on being silly. The whole thing is completely silly. Completely silly with some exotic locations mixed in. One of the interesting biographical notes about Karl Barks that I learned from the story notes and the introduction is that Karl Barks actually never traveled much outside of the United States, or outside of, I think, the United States and parts of Mexico or something like that. So all these story locations that he sends his characters to are just things he learned from National Geographic. But it's a typical silly story where, actually, let me start at the beginning. Square eggs are discovered in the museum. So everyone thinks they're blocks, but it turns out they're actually eggs. This sets a chain of events in motion, which ends up with Donald Duck and his nephews on a quest to find out where these square eggs are from. It's a hook that kept me turning the pages, because I wanted to see what would happen. Where are the square eggs from? Are there square chickens or a square village, or what's going on? And maybe a hook that kept me impatiently turning the pages as the story meanders through this and that But an entertaining story, lots of ridiculousness in here, and goes on several twists and turns, and certainly held my interest while I was reading it. Then we get several other stories in here. Another thing of note, maybe. Sorry, let me back up here. This is Donald Duck going to exotic locations. Uncle Scrooge is not yet part of the lineup at this point. In fact, according to the story notes, Uncle Scrooge had only been introduced relatively recently. So this is 1948, 1949. Uncle Scrooge had only been introduced, I think, a year before, a couple years before. I don't remember exactly. Uncle Scrooge does show up in a couple of these stories, but he's not part of Donald's adventures. He's more the MacGuffin that sets Donald's adventures in place. So he'll have some sort of quest that Donald needs to go on to get his approval or something like that. And as is pointed out in the story notes, at this point in his evolution, visually he looks a little bit different. He's got this, I don't know what this is, some sort of little beard over here. And he is not quite as lovable. Is lovable the right word? He's more antagonistic than he will eventually evolve to be. He's not bad guy is a little bit harsh, but he's more of one of Donald Duck's antagonists than one of the gang. Here he pops up in the next story. Again, there's a voodoo doctor that is, a voodoo curse that's after Scrooge, which ends up getting Donald Duck instead. And Scrooge just thinks the whole thing is hilarious, much to Donald Duck's anger. And that this sets in motion the quest for this story. Where, again, Scrooge sits it out and stays at home. So, again, these stories are from 1948 to 1949. And I think Carl Barks's period was from the early 40s, like 1942, up to 1966. So, Uncle Scrooge's heyday in the 50s and 60s has yet to come. By the way, speaking of the voodoo story, it is, I guess, maybe as you would expect from a story from 1948, a little bit outdated in its racial caricatures. You can see here. But that's it wasn't made nowadays. If it was made nowadays, obviously it would be very different. I suppose there might be some controversy with reprinting stories that have these caricatures in them, but I am certainly of the opinion that this is cultural history. This story was printed once upon a time, so I think you just have to reprint it in full and just acknowledge that some parts of it are a little bit problematic, which they do. I mean, how could they not? In the story notes here, talk about how the stereotypes are unfortunate, but also make a point of emphasizing that Carl Barks does seem to be in sympathy with the Native Africans in this story. What else is there to talk about? I mean, there's a bunch of stories in this collection. I don't want to go through every story in the collection, but just to say that I enjoyed reading this collection. I wasn't overjoyed by by it. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't completely enthralled. It was pleasant enough to read. It no longer amuses me as much as it did when I was 7 years old or younger. I mean, how old was I when I used to read the Donald Duck comic books? About 7, I think. 6 or 7 or 8. And I remember, just getting completely engrossed in those stories back in those days. That engrossment no longer exists. That's one of the trade-offs you have to make when you grow up and develop your brain a little bit. I certainly still found them interesting. Glad I read this collection, but yeah, to me it had its limits for how appealing it could be for an adult reader. But that's just me. As the introduction and story notes at the end make clear, there are any number of adult academics who find these stories endless source of fascination and research, and have taught them in university classes, in the case of Donald Alt, hundreds of times over. I guess one more note I will make. I ordered this collection for my school library out here in Vietnam as part of my project to try and get more comic books in my school library to get my students reading more in English. I believe the library data shows that this book hasn't been terribly popular with the Vietnamese students at our library, but I'm hoping it'll catch on in a bit. Who knows? We'll see. But just in case anyone else is out there considering ordering these books for their school library or something like that, I do worry a little bit of that. I mean, this book has been in our school library for less than a year now. And look at this binding here. Seems like it's coming apart. Now, does it just seem that way, or is that actually coming apart here? And look at this. I don't think it's been through too harsh wear and tear. I mean, I certainly can't speak for everyone who has checked this book out over the last 9 months. Certainly, I feel like I've been careful with it. But the volume feels a bit fragile to me, and maybe it wasn't meant to be in school libraries. Maybe it was meant to be, for 40 or 50-year-old Carl Barks completists who would have this on their bookshelf nicely at home. But can you hear that when I turn the pages? It creaks a little bit. Like you can. Let me shut up a minute and turn. Oh, now it's not doing it. But sometimes I feel like there's like a creaking sound, like, I don't know. Oh, so that, this is just a note on the publishing or the binding of this particular volume. But something to keep in mind maybe if you're considering forking out money for this. The stories themselves are great, though. Or, like I said, mildly amusing for an adult reader is the verdict I'm going with. Okay, I'm going to finish things off here.